For this week, we're going to talk about a number of significant changes that happened in the life of the Episcopal Church in the 1960s and 70s. These will focus on further developments in the area of civil rights and integration in the Episcopal Church, the women's ordination movement, and prayer book revision and liturgical renewal. So to start off, let's pick up the story we've been following around how the civil rights movement, or the Southern Freedom Movement, is impacting the life of the Episcopal Church. Presiding Bishop John Hines is elected in 1964, and in 1967, he establishes at General Convention that year the General Convention Special Program. This is a program established in the context of a wide series of riots, civil unrest, uprisings against police brutality and oppressive living conditions in a number of urban areas all across the United States. John Hines goes with one of his advisors, Leah Modesti, who is advising him on racial issues in the Episcopal Church, and tours a number of African-American inner-city neighborhoods. Especially he goes to Harlem and to Newark, New Jersey. And through this, he's persuaded that the Episcopal Church ought to invest substantially in programs that will alleviate racial and economic justice. And so he sets aside a quarter of the operating budget of the Episcopal Church, and it's funneled into this special program of General Convention. I want to read to you from a passage where he is laying out his vision for this special program in a sermon he delivers at General Convention in 1967. And he's talking about the money spent. This is on page 510 of Documents of Witness by Armentrout and Slocum, the second to last paragraph. He says, "What is before us is not primarily a matter of money. Money can help if we take our hands off its control, giving it because we realize that it's God's and not ours. But if we attempt to use money to buy our way out of responsibility, the less credible we will appear to men and women struggling with their misery, and the less likely we are to build our part of a bridge between our alienations." So he's recognizing that the Episcopal Church is a tremendously privileged institution and it has significant financial resources. And so it ought to seek to speak to the conditions around it with those resources. But Hines is cautioning that we can't think that just because we contribute money, we have resolved the problems that the Episcopal Church must face for itself. Rather, he thinks the use of financial expenditures will heighten the awareness of the members of the church, and that will spur it to greater transformation. One of the significant flaws here is that Hines did not consult with African American Episcopalian clergy before establishing the General Convention Special Program. Indeed, through his relationship with Leah Modesti, many of the people brought in to administer the program to the church center in New York City are non-Episcopalians. What this does is actually create a rift between African-American Episcopalians and John Hines and his leadership circle. And so two groups that should have been allies actually find themselves in conflict as a result of this special program. This leads to the founding of the Union of Black Episcopalians, or in a way, the reemergence of this group to work towards greater representation of Black Episcopalians in decision-making processes of the Episcopal Church. As well, there are many bishops who are resistant to the special program, especially in the South, because many of the economic and racial justice initiatives are aimed at Southern contexts. These Southern bishops are often resentful that they're not consulted about ministry that's going to be done in their diocese. Moreover, some of the program funds go to fund Black nationalist groups that are really separatist groups. There's a Mexican American separatist group that is funded. In this general sense that a strain of radicalism whose ideology might actually be in conflict with the broad teachings of the Episcopal Church. So what you have then is tension for Bishop Hines on two wings. One, Black Episcopalians, who he needs as allies, and two, diocesan bishops, who constitute the House of Bishops, which ought to be John Hines's natural base of support for his work, because he has been elected out of the House of Bishops. And so what we have is going into the Special General Convention of 1969, a fracturing of some of the alliances that John Hines needs to make this work. The Special General Convention is held at the University of Notre Dame. I believe this is the only special calling of a General Convention outside of its irregular triennial schedule. There are mechanisms within the canons of the Episcopal Church to make this happen. This event is disrupted by radicals, and there's a debate that merges over reparations. Black nationalists who are coordinating internally with some of the folks around Leo Modesti's circle take the stage at General Convention and are given the microphone and really speak to a demand towards reparations. You can listen to an audio clip of some of this that I've linked to elsewhere. And there's a feeling by many that this is a moment where the church has sort of lost its center, that there's so much dissension at this General Convention that it's alienating. Because a lot of the African American Episcopalian leadership is not involved in the decision-making process, there's also a significant degree of tension. So I had you read a reading from the Reverend Primo concerning the call for Black Episcopalian clergy to be better represented in the decision-making process of the Episcopal Church, and really decrying tokenism. Furthermore, regarding reparations, there is a study done about whether or not the Episcopal Church ought to fund reparations, but no formal moves were made at that time. It is worth noting that today there are some dioceses who are doing what they call reparations work. The Episcopal Diocese of both Maryland and of Texas are at the forefront of some of this work currently. As a result of a lot of the dissension that happens at the Special General Convention, the funding for the special program is really fully cut substantially at the 1970 General Convention, and at the 1973 General Convention, the General Convention special program loses all of its internal support, and it simply ceases to exist. At this time, though, the Office of Black Ministries is established at the Church Center in New York City. So this is a significant victory for the African American Episcopalian leadership that was seeking to have a better representation, to have a seat at the table within the administrative structure of the Episcopal Church itself. In many ways, the special program was a missed opportunity. Vine Deloria Jr., who is a American Indian theologian, an Episcopalian from an Episcopalian clergy family, offered some reflections on this. He noted that the church made the most tangible but least sophisticated response, which is offering money to address a need. Vine Deloria notes that the real need was to create a substantial change in the theology of the Episcopal Church and its educational practices and its catechesis to really alter the way in which human diversity and difference is understood and functions in a redeemed body that is the body of Christ. Otherwise, the church will simply become a pale version of a private foundation. It'll just be another charitable, non-governmental organization. And so Deloria's critique here really echoes John Hines's own warnings to say that we can't look at the money as simply throwing a solution at a problem. There really needs to be a substantial change. So the tragedy of Hines is he's not able to shepherd along the transformative change that he had hoped the special program would be. John Hines is under tremendous pressure and resigns from being presiding bishop early, largely as a result of the failures of this special program. In 1974, John Allin, the diocesan bishop of Mississippi, becomes the presiding bishop. Now, he has difficulty getting consent for being elected from the House of Deputies at General Convention because he had more conservative positions on questions of civil rights and women's ordination. Women's ordination is being considered in parallel right now, and we're going to get to that conversation in the next video. One of the things to remember about Allin is he is in favor of integration and desegregation, but he had endorsed that more gradualist approach that his colleague in his neighboring diocese, Bishop John Carpenter, had also endorsed. Gardner Shattuck, in his book Episcopalians and Race, makes the observation that John Hines wants to simply inaugurate the kingdom of heaven and sort of instantly transform the life of the church into this realized prophetic eschatological community. Whereas Allin is much more of a pragmatist. He's aware, deeply aware, of the racial realities that exist in the church, and he wants to find pragmatic ways forward for addressing them. So you have the idealist and the pragmatist between Hines and Allin. As Gardner Shattuck notes, I quote, Allin displayed a canny understanding of the true nature of the fragmented, culture-bound institution he had been elected to lead. What's ironic here, then, is that it's really Allin who keeps on shepherding the work of integration in the life of the church, insofar as he invests in trying to increase the racial and ethnic diversity of the clergy. He invests in the growth in Latino and Hispanic ministry, and he helps to establish a number of these offices for ethnic ministry within the governance structure of the Episcopal Church, or at the church center, rather. Now, Carla Roland Guzman is going to critique some of the creation of these specialized ministries when we look at her book Unmasking Latinx Theology later on in this course. And that is a worthwhile critique. But it's also important to simply to note that Allin is seeking to make concrete contributions towards the question of how will the Episcopal Church more fully reflect the actual diversity of the body of Christ within this specific context. This commitment to racial equality then also shows up in other places. I would argue that the final question of the baptismal covenant in the 1979 Book of Common Prayer, will you respect the dignity of every human person, is an outcome of this process of dealing with the question of race and integration in the Episcopal Church from the 1940s through the 1970s. And so I'd argue in some ways that the civil rights era, or this crucible of the Episcopal Church having to pass through and reckon with its own self-understanding in the context of the Southern Freedom Movement, helps to create the contemporary contours of the Episcopal Church that we recognize today. This is a lot to process. I'm looking forward to talking about this more with you in class.